Probably one of the most common questions asked about the Ukraine war is how long will it last? Um, Now, as a rule, conventional wars don't last that long. Um, but today I'm going to make an attempt to at least provide some boundaries for when this war will end. Um, right now, uh, the war seems to be uh, well. There's relatively little activity going. Uh, I know there's talk about a major Russian offensive taking place, and theoretically that may be happening at this very moment. But it's unclear from the information that's available that there's a major offensive, um, as opposed to just probing attacks or other tactical moves. Um, the winter's been surprisingly uh, uh, um, inactive militarily. That might be explained by a lack of ammunition and or equipment, possibly on both sides, probably on the Ukrainian side, and that would lead to a lessening of the intensity of combat. It's also possible that the mobilization effort in Russia has encouraged them to reduce activity over the winter. And it is quite possible that the Russian forces, after the lack of success in 2022, may be engaged in a major reorganization. We don't know. So the earliest opportunity for this war to end at this point is likely the summer of 2023. It seems really unlikely, but that's about the earliest, and that's mainly because in a month and a half from now, offensive operations will become much more difficult due to weather conditions, mainly the mud, which makes traversing the ground much more difficult, and it'll slow everything down for a few months. Now, if you follow the information about Western delivery plans, you'll probably realize that about the only major heavy equipment, new heavy equipment, will be Leopard 2 tanks. They'll be available this summer. The M1 tanks that the United States has promised aren't expected to be delivered until the end of the year. And the Leopard 1 tanks that have been promised are likely to be delivered late this year and early next year. And now there's talk about providing strike fighters such as the F-16 or the Eurofighter as well. And that too would take a few months of training, even for an experienced pilot, to familiarize them with the new systems and how to best utilize them. All of this, therefore, seems to suggest that the most common expectation is that this war will last at least into 2024. Now, historically speaking, a long conventional war is one that lasts over 1 year. So this war is going to be a long war later this month. Now, 3 years or more is extremely unlikely, historically speaking. So we can bet that the war is likely to end by March 2025. However, and it's a big one, World War I was a conventional war that lasted 4 years. World War II lasted 6 years. And the longest conventional war was the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, which lasted over 7 years. So that's from a historical perspective. 8 years is more or less the upper bound on how long a conventional war will last. Now, why do I keep saying conventional war? Well, it's important to recognize that it's a special subset of wars that are fought. Insurgencies can go on for decades. Conventional wars generally can't. And by conventional, what I mean is that each side controls specific territory. It would be unthinkable, for example, using the Ukraine war as an example, it would be unthinkable for a Russian unit to just go and deploy in Kiev. And likewise, it would be unthinkable for a Ukrainian infantry unit to deploy in, let's say, Sevastopol. Just like that. So each side has territory that it clearly has control over, which differentiates this kind of war from a war such as that fought in Afghanistan, where NATO forces could pretty much go anywhere, but when they left, the Taliban might come back. So that's one thing, specific territory is controlled. The other thing is that there's a very well-defined boundary space where the fighting takes place. And that's called the front line. And that's one of the characteristics of a conventional war. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that conventional wars strain the capacity of armies engaged to remain coherent. And the historical evidence suggests that you can't go on forever. So that's pretty much where that sits. And so best bet, March 2025, but the war could, based on historical experience, last until 2030. Now, it's worth putting out there before I end this that assuming Western support continues, the longer the war lasts, the higher probability of Ukraine winning. And alternatively, a lack of continued support will most likely result in an end to the conventional fighting and quite possibly a transition to a long insurgency. There seems to be very little likelihood of a negotiated settlement at this point, and it's more likely that a negotiated settlement results from victories on the battlefield by one side or the other. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully this war will end in 2024, but it could go on to 2025, or in the worst case into 2030. Let me know what you think. and thanks for your time.